Hello. Today I will be covering one of the films from the 1990s, which was Beloved, and one that was one of the more recent films that was 12 Years a Slave. I will start by covering Beloved, which was released in 1999, and it follows Setha, who was a slave who attained her freedom by running away from school teacher, which was her former evil and cruel slave master, to reach her own freedom, which wasn't exactly all she thought it was going to be cracked up to be. She was very emotionally damaged by what had happened to her while under the care of school teacher and some of the things that had happened to her, and this manifests itself greatly throughout the movie. In somewhat supernatural ways, I would say, that the haunting that she goes through at the beginning and the re-emergence of her daughter later in the movie are kind of more physical embodiments of the emotional toil that she had gone through, in my opinion. And this actually kind of mirrors within this movie the way the thoughts about social issues and race relations kind of switched in the 1990s back to kind of the civil rights era idea again. See, throughout the 90s, we had the issue early in the 90s, 1991 as a matter of fact, of the Rodney King beating, which was caught on tape. A lot of this tape was shown to national media and on the news, and most of us who were alive during that time and old enough remember seeing this everywhere, as it was a pretty big deal. It was a gentleman being repeatedly struck and beaten with batons and kicks by several police officers who had surrounded him. A lot of the background to this was not really given a whole lot, so all we saw was a man getting beaten without having much of a background on why. But this opened a lot of eyes across the country, both in the black communities who were like, yeah, this happens all the time, but largely in the rural and white communities kind of were taken aback by such a thing occurring. And it kind of opened some eyes, like I said, to some of the injustices faced by these people on a daily basis. And even the president himself came down and made the claim that he was unaware or unsure how these gentlemen could still have jobs after seeing what he saw on the tape, regardless of the circumstances. So this was very much a re-emergence of civil rights and the treatment of African Americans in our country to the national spotlight and the national conversation, which it had not been as much a part of throughout the 80s. And this idea carried forward throughout the entire decade. So even though this movie was released 8 years after the fact, it was still perpetuating that started the conversation that continued. This actually led to, throughout the 90s, a lot of artists, whether it be Tupac Shakur or many filmmakers, using kind of this idea and this widespread understanding of what was going on as a tool to continue their own message that this is happening, it is wrong, and it needs to stop. I've got some video of the beating. It is difficult to watch. There's no need to watch the whole thing, but if you just want to get an idea of what I'm talking about, it is on a slide right here in the middle of my presentation that you are more than welcome to watch if you are unsure about exactly how it happened. But it like I said, it is tough to watch, much like the movie Beloved itself. One of the things that this movie highlights is not only the brutal treatment of slaves, but how it affects them after they actually attain their freedom, the very few that do. Setha, who is the main character, played by Oprah Winfrey, was raped by the school teacher at one point, and when she went and told the mistress of the house, of the plantation, of whatever the case may be, which was school teacher's sister, it caused a lot of issues and led to her getting beaten and tied up and whipped mercilessly. And then fast forward, when she's trying to escape with her husband and she goes to look for him in the barn, again, school teacher takes his nephews and they forcibly rape her, and she is very pregnant at the time, and they take the milk out of her breast in a very graphic and difficult to see situation happening, but it was there to highlight some of the things these people went through. This situation alone caused her husband, who she was in the barn looking for, to kind of go crazy and lose his mind and was no longer able to function, and so he became just one of the help that couldn't really think for himself a whole heck of a lot after that point. It was really a sad situation all around. Now, after the sexual assault, she had escaped with her children who she had sent ahead, and herself and her child that she was carrying had escaped to her mother-in-law's house and thought they were free. She was helping out around the house, helping out in the garden, when school teacher found them, and as he pulled up, she saw him coming, and thinking she had no other choice, took her children into the shed and tried to kill all of them. She succeeded in killing her oldest daughter, did not succeed at killing the children, and was attempting to drown her newborn when people bust in and stopped her. And school teacher saw this, was disgusted, and decided just to leave and left them alone. It was kind of this guilt that manifests itself in the haunting, I believe, at the beginning of the movie within the house once her mother-in-law has died. It also led to not a whole lot of support from the surrounding community. They saw her as a murderer, someone who killed her own child, and or children, attempted to kill her own children, and didn't give her a lot of support, weren't real friendly with her, and she was very untrusting of everyone. So not only did she kind of isolate herself within the house, she would not let her children leave the house, including her youngest daughter, Denver, who goes on to play a pretty big role within the movie. And she didn't really care for her boys leaving the house, from what I could tell, but they ran away pretty early because of her psychosis and the haunting that was terrorizing them within the home they shared. Beloved shows up a little bit later, which is kind of, in my opinion, the manifestation of her guilt over having killed her daughter and not allowing her daughter to grow up and have a life. When Beloved shows up, everybody is very happy except Paul D., who was a man from her past in the previous plantation that had come back into her life and killed the haunting or the apparition or whatever it was within the house by letting her let go of everything she had gone through. But after doing that, she is now focused on this daughter she had killed. And once she starts dwelling on that, Beloved shows up, and everybody's happy to see her except Paul D. I think he kind of notices something is not quite right there and something is not what it seems, but everybody else is just ecstatic to have her around. Setha, to the point that she actually starts kind of favoring Beloved over Denver and letting Beloved have things and do things that Denver was never allowed to do, and giving her more food than Denver. Things along those lines, which caused some issues between Denver and Beloved at the end. But she was still happy to have her around because it was someone she could talk to, which was not something she had had up to that point. Overall, this was a very difficult movie to watch. as far as the graphic brutality in which was displayed within the rape scenes and the stealing of the breast milk and the beating of the dog with its eye hanging out. And there were several things that were just difficult to watch, but it was all by design, I believe, to show that the cruelty and damage done by these slave owners to these slaves was much more than just the scars on their back. I think it was helped fueled by the refocus on race relations during the 1990s. Again, after the Rodney King beating and a few other incidents that had occurred that kind of brought that idea back to reality and what was going on and put it back in the social conscience that these things happen and they are not good. And the fact that they overlapped it with the horror aspects was kind of a way to be jarring enough to make it show that these deep lasting and hard hitting effects are real and last a long time, and sometimes you might not be able to see them with your eyes, but they are there. Overall, I thought it was a pretty good movie, and though it was difficult to watch, I believe it displayed what it wanted to in a very real and true manner, and I really actually enjoyed it once I was able to get in the right mind frame to enjoy it. The other movie I will be covering is going to be 12 Years a Slave. This was released in 2013. It's a movie about the kidnapping of Solomon Northup, who was a slave born free in New York and was a talented violinist. It shows the fact that intelligent slaves had to hide their intelligence for fear of repercussions from their slave masters. It also shows through the kidnapping the kind of hidden underbelly we don't hear a lot about that was going on in the North at the time of the kidnapping of free black people to be sent back to slaves as simply a money grab for, you know, the white men that are involved. It also kind of goes on to show how many of the slave owners and the law itself in the South saw slaves as not human beings, and they were nothing but property, which can have quite a lasting effect on people throughout, you know, if that's how they are viewed. I'll start out by speaking about how the race relations in the 2010s might have helped kind of focus or underwrite some of what was being told within the movie. This movie was released shortly after the killing of a young man named Trayvon Martin in Florida by a gentleman named George Zimmerman. Trayvon was an unarmed young black man walking home from a convenience store who was shot and killed in his neighborhood just a little over a block away from the home he was going back to that he shared with his father's girlfriend. He was stalked, and stories of the incident kind of waver. Maybe attacked, maybe he attacked Mr. Zimmerman, we're not sure, but there was a scuffle that ensued, a gun was brought out, and he was killed. Zimmerman was later found not guilty of the murder because there was not any evidence that could definitively show who was the aggressor and who was not, and based on the standard ground self-defense law held in Florida, he got away with it or was found not guilty of it, or however you want to phrase that. He was not punished for the death of this young man. This kind of opened up the Pandora's box of how race relations are still not right in this country and how people are treated. Since then, there have been several shootings of unarmed black men by police officers, none of whom have really paid the price, and it kind of showed that side of what is still happening today. and angered people and brought people to taking action, which is something that needs to be done, in my opinion. As far as the attitudes taken towards slaves by many of the slave masters, it was very wide range ideas. The first one he goes to is a gentleman named Ford, who is very sympathetic. He's a very nice man. He takes care of Northup. He gives him a violin. He treats all of his slaves with respect and treats them nicely and allows him to come up with ideas and forge out an area through the river that he could bring a raft down to help cut down costs, and almost invites him in as kind of a partner in the whole thing, that term being used very loosely. But by doing this, it angers some of his overseers and some of his other plantation helpers, who try to hang Northup until Ford can save him. And when he tries to tell Ford he's actually a free man, Ford wants to hear nothing of it, and actually sells him to save his life to a man he knows to be very cruel. Now, though he was a nice man and very friendly and helpful and all of that, he is just as much to blame for what happens to Northup as anyone else, because he did not step in to stop the situation. He allowed it to continue and actually sent him somewhere even worse. The man he sent him to was named Master Epps, and Master and Mistress Epps were both very, very cruel individuals. They were awful towards their slaves, with beatings and rapes and verbal abuse all across the board. One of the worst incidents was with a young female slave named Patsy. Patsy was the best picker of cotton in the fields, and Master Epps was favored towards her and would routinely rape her in a show that he loved her, which in and of itself is a disgusting situation. But through this, Mistress Epps became extremely jealous of Patsy. She did everything she could to hurt Patsy in any way possible, including eventually not allowing her to have soap. Patsy, due to her favored status on the Sabbath, was allowed to go to a neighboring plantation and speak with the slave master's wife, who herself was a former slave, on, like I said, on the Sabbath day, and she had gone there to get a bar of soap. When she came back, Master Epps thought that she was over there sleeping with the other slave master, the other master of the plantation, which there was no reason or evidence to prove that, but he thought it had happened, so he tied her up, made Northup whip her for some time, and then he himself took over and brutalized her and whipped her until there was flesh and blood and sinew all over the place, and it was a show of unnecessary force, which kind of ties back in with all of these unarmed black individuals being shot and killed, some of them in the back, showing unnecessary force with no righteous or reasonable cause. So it kind of showed that dichotomy of, not dichotomy, it showed that that same mentality of viewing the situation as it happens and kind of being a little confused as to why these men were getting killed and why was she getting beaten, and it kind of brought those ideas back to the mind a little bit. Well-educated slaves at the time were scared to let their masters know that they could read or write, because it could lead to serious repercussions. The slave masters could kill them, they could become jealous of them, they could fear them based on wondering if they are trying to organize an uprising or do several things. Northup is warned about this on his trip right after he gets kidnapped on the paddle boat down the river by a gentleman who has very well thought out and deep conversations with him. However, once this gentleman reaches New Orleans and sees his master there waiting to reclaim him as property he is, he immediately reverts back to his, "Oh, yes, sir, thank you, sir," type of speech patterns and not showing the intelligence he actually has. By doing this, he is able to be brought back into the fold by his former master and taken back to where he actually has it somewhat decent, because apparently his former master treated him pretty well. In conclusion, for 12 Years a Slave, it shows the views that even the different slave masters held towards their slaves at the time, whether they were benevolent and nice, or they were just needlessly cruel and mean, or the one that fell in love with his favorite slave and ended up marrying her and giving her the power of being mistress of the house. These were all present during that time of slavery. And though they may not have been cruel to their slaves, they did nothing to stop it, which kind of puts them as complicit in the whole situation, which transitions to today's views of all these unarmed black men being shot. And if you're sitting back and not outraged and not raising your voice and not doing anything you can do to stop it, then maybe you're seen as complicit in it as well. That's kind of the feeling I got towards it. It's a difficult thing to kind of speak about, being a white man in this country, but I kind of agree with that if you're not willing to stand up and take a stand to try to stop these things, then are you really much better than those who are doing it? I don't really know. I really enjoyed this movie. I thought it did a good job of showing the different facets of slave ownership and slavery throughout the South, and I would actually recommend this highly to anyone who just wants to see a good movie. I thought it was fantastic. So that will conclude my portion of talking about Beloved and 12 Years a Slave.